Emotions Matter, brought to you by emaw.com. That's EMAWW.com, your solution for emotional intelligence. Welcome to the Emotions Matter podcast. I'm grateful to be joined today by Scott Hartley. Scott is a venture capitalist and startup advisor to more than a dozen notable tech names like Kimono Labs, Spire, CoverWallet, Clink, and others. He's also the author of the best-selling title, The Fuzzy and the Techie, which was picked for the Financial Times Book of the Month and finalist for the Brackenbauer Prize for an author under 35. Scott was formerly a partner at one of Silicon Valley's premier Sand Hill Road venture capital firms, Moore Davidow Ventures, along with Metamorphic Ventures in New York. Scott has served as the White House Innovation Fellow and has worked at Google and Facebook along with Harvard's Berkman Center for Internet and Society. You can find his published writings in Forbes, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, Boston Review, and others. Welcome, Scott. It's great to have you with us.
Thanks a lot for having me, John.
All right, good stuff. Well, let's just jump right in. Why don't you give our listeners a little perspective and history into your venture capital roots? Just guessing maybe you built some of those relationships during your time at Stanford.
Yeah, so thanks so much for having me on the podcast. To give our listeners just a little context about sort of venture capital and what it is, really it's the partners on the capital side who are financing sort of the earliest stages of a startup company or a business. And so generally, when somebody has a good idea and they say, well, I'm going to get together with a couple friends and start building a prototype, start building an MVP or a minimum viable product, then they'll go and meet with angel investors. They'll go start meeting with small firms who will provide sort of the seed capital to help that company hire the people they need to hire, start building the networks and the connections that they need to get the business off the ground. And so my background working at Moore Davidow Ventures and working at Metamorphic Ventures was really to be part of two different teams and two different sort of size funds where we were providing some of that early stage capital to really interesting sort of groundbreaking entrepreneurs building things in all different sectors, from digital health to clean technology to consumer internet companies to sort of enterprise focused companies. And then you're really, you're a partner, you're on the team and you're helping that entrepreneur, helping that team build successfully, in any way that you can help with introductions and with, kind of opening doors to markets and trying to get them beta customers and things like that. You're sort of, you're part of the, not part of the founding team, but you're certainly part of the, early DNA that's shaping, where that company goes.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So from college and et cetera, what really drove your interest in being a part of a venture capital group?
So my background was having grown up in Silicon Valley, and I was really fortunate to sort of see the boom and the bust of Silicon Valley, through the 90s, the growth and then sort of the pullback of the first .com, boom and bust. And I think, through that time, I always had peripheral interests, but I always, did have an interest in entrepreneurship and in technology just from my surroundings. But, at Stanford, I studied international relations. I studied political theory. I really loved, studying abroad and sort of getting out of Silicon Valley. But I found that the pull was, fairly strong, back to these great companies that were really creating change in the world. And so, even though I departed the Valley and, did things at the State Department and did things, abroad, I kept getting pulled back by this sort of gravity of what was happening in Silicon Valley. And so after graduation, I found my way into Google, from Google to Facebook and sort of did some grad degrees along the way. But I always sort of wanted this 60,000 foot view into what was happening, kind of the macro trends, around the technology that I was seeing. And venture capital is really one way to sort of have this 60,000 foot view where, you're able to not just focus on one thing, but you're kind of touching multiple companies at the same time. You're part finance, but you're also part consultant. You're also part advisor. You're also part, entrepreneur in some way. And so really for my sort of ADD personality in some small ways, I think it enabled me to have, one soundbite for what I was doing when in fact, I was really doing 10 things at once.
Well, that sounds terrific. And I'm a little jealous, quite frankly. I think you've been to 60, 70 countries. I like to travel as well, but it sounds like you've been a lot more places than I'll ever be.
Well, and that's thanks to great companies like Google. So, my early career, I helped set up a team with Google India, and so I was based in Hyderabad and in Gurgaon, India, for a little over a year. And that really, having a jumping off point when you're in another part of the world really enables you to travel to a lot of far flung places because, when you're based in Delhi, Nepal is only a 2-hour flight away. So it really kind of unlocks the ability to see new places.
And I would assume it will give you a nice broader perspective as to world business and et cetera, how things are done over there, et cetera, and all other parts of the world.
I think it challenges your own biases and it sort of unlocks an understanding that, for me, spending my first year at Google main campus in Mountain View, there was this perception that main campus and what people were doing there was we were the most passionate Googlers. And then you get to a place like India and you realize actually people, they sleep and live and breathe Google. They wear t-shirts every single day of the week. They absolutely love the company. And it kind of, pulls back that assumption that, people that are farther away don't care as much about, what we were building. And so I think it really challenges your own biases and kind of unlocks empathy and does a lot of positive things, I think, as a person.
Gotcha. Great. Well, so let's dive a little deeper into your role as a venture capitalist. I've heard you on a couple of other interviews refer to the transactions as a courtship. For this audience, of course, that's going to trigger some specific emotions that are part of building relationships. In some cases, that might be curiosity, desire, or quite frankly, just lust. So what emotions are you looking to evoke or see in these future leaders of what could be the next Google or Facebook?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, the lens that venture, the capitalists bring to how they evaluate deals kind of depends on the core ethos of each different individual. And so I think some people look heavily at the technology and they say, I don't care what person is like. If they're building technology that's 100 times better than the status quo, I'm going to make an investment in that company. Other people look at sort of the macro dynamics of markets and they say, well, the way things are moving, I think that, I believe in this, where this is skating into the future, this trend may come to fruition. And then other people, I think, and I'd put myself in this third category, really are looking to partner with people that are, sort of at this incredible level of focus and curiosity and passion for what they're doing. And they've identified a problem that they're keenly aware of and they're uniquely positioned to help solve. And so I think that the traits that I personally, really resonate with are authenticity, number one. I think somebody who's building something that you can tell, you can kind of read between the lines and you say, this person isn't just going after trying to make a quick buck or trying to flip a company and sell in a year or whatever it might be. This is somebody who really has identified a problem that is fundamental to what they want to do with their life. They're willing to dedicate the time and effort and focus to get something off the ground and really, make something move here. Because I think that, you don't realize, but the CEO or the founder of a company is often the chief evangelist as well. Mm-hmm. It's somebody who really has to be able to sell the vision. Looking at some of the companies that I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit, that I profile in the book, some of these incredible CEOs of some of these new companies don't necessarily have technical degrees. And there's one person that I talk about specifically named Caitlin Gleason, and she had a theater arts degree from Stony Brook University, but she's a force of nature. And she was somebody that knew how to take words and turn them into when she was on Broadway, turning words into emotions and turning words into ways that people could identify with a character. And she said, actually, this skill set is really relevant to what I have to do as a CEO. I have to convince people of my vision. I have to convince them to leave their job to work for me. And these are all characteristics that I think, when I'm meeting with a company, somebody that has that level of energy and focus and charisma is a huge piece of if I think that they can be successful.
So the CEO is having to evoke emotions out of their potential investors and the people that are looking at their products, et cetera, and they've got to be as dynamic as anybody else.
Yeah, I think they're the primary creators of the culture that their company comes to embody. And so they don't have to necessarily be, the biggest extrovert. I don't think that, that's a characteristic you necessarily have to have. You look at somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, who's kind of a quiet leader. Sheryl Sandberg wears the mantle of kind of being the internal extrovert and being the rah, get people focused on sort of what they need to do. But he's the quiet sort of leader at the helm who I think has charted a course of where the company is going, sort of the focus on engineering, the discipline around what he wants to do in connecting the world. And so I think you can be both an introvert and, heavily charismatic. I think that those things aren't, necessarily mutually exclusive.
So, as you move into the stages after you've made a deal with one of the startups, I guess, solidified the deal to be their venture capital partner, what have you found to be like the most difficult or unpleasant emotions of the new leaders, and how kind of did you have to deal with them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, most companies, the founding team is more than one person. And so typically there's a dynamic between 2 or 3 individuals. And I think what sets a lot of companies up for success is also the tension that can lead to their demise. And what I mean by that is the things that set a company up for success are that the leadership probably touch on a few different skill sets. One person may be the deep, focused coder that's building the product. They want to go heads down, get into all the details and make sure that it works. The other person may be the high level, big picture thinker that doesn't want to worry about the details. They just want to, skate into the macro trend, and they want to, sort of just sell the vision today, even though the product's not built yet. And so you have these tensions, right? Uh-huh. And I think that what sets a company up for success are you have composite skills where you're feeding off each other and you're able to kind of each be accretive to the business. You're not overlapping entirely with what the other person, if you have 2 people that are carbon copies of each other, oftentimes I don't think those companies do as well. Mm-hmm. But, because those people can be very different, sometimes their personalities are very different. Sometimes their values can be different. Sometimes the motivations for the outcomes can be different. And so in my experience, the toughest conversations and toughest situations are where values aren't aligned, or where, one person wants to take it slow and sort of sees the financing round as now their platform where they can spend all their time kind of building as they please, and it's sort of a carte blanche to do whatever they want. It's almost as if we've invested in them as people, like a MacArthur Genius Grant. Mm-hmm. And the other person saying, well, actually we have a responsibility to build the product that we promised the venture capitalists that we were going to build. And so, we really have to get going, and we've got a clock. We've sort of flipped over the hourglass, and we're, as we run out of money, we have to have accomplished something by that point. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to raise the next round and the company goes out of business. And so sometimes these tensions come into play between the 2 personalities. And so, yeah, the one experience that calls to mind is, where there was sort of an acquisition on the table with a company, mm-hmm. and one founder saw this as a great way to kind of continue to build what they had initially set out to build, and the other said, well, but we still have millions of dollars in the bank, and we can kind of do as we please, and take our sweet time over the next 5 years building this. And it was really a misalignment between sort of the motivations of what each wanted to accomplish. And so, ultimately, there was a tussle, and there was some intervention on behalf of team members and investors, and those are the situations that you kind of don't want to get into. So you want to make sure that you have accretive personalities where you're both adding different things to the business, but you fundamentally agree on what you're going to build, mm-hmm. and sort of what success looks like to you.
So I think you've already touched on it a little bit, but on the flip side, the guys that just just get it. They just go for it. Give us a perspective on some of those and some of the emotions that you found that they just move through it.
Yeah, I think the characteristic we have a tendency, everyone has their own biases, and I think, early on I was biased toward, I would see past success, for example. You look at somebody who has only encountered success in their life, and you say, well, gosh, they're building this company and they've only encountered success, therefore they must be destined to be successful in this next venture. So let me, get involved in this startup. And I think actually in some ways that's the wrong mentality. Oftentimes it's the person who's faced adversity and persevered in the face of adversity, the person who's really shown grit and the ability to kind of pound through a wall, when like everyone says this is not possible, this industry will never change, or you can't do that. Oftentimes it's sort of the person who suspends belief and sort of does it anyway. And, obviously as we've seen with Uber and other cases, that can lead to other problems. But I do think that characteristic of grit and focus and perseverance, not necessarily somebody who's encountered a lot of success already, but somebody who's really in the face of challenge stood up to it, and that's a really important characteristic. And so, the people that I've seen be wildly successful aren't always the ones with the fancy degrees. They're not always the ones that have the perfect resume. They're the ones that really found a problem and really, 2 years in, 3 years in, 4 years in, they're still fighting as hard as they were the first day. Mm-hmm. And you take a step back and say, gosh, where did they get that fight? How do they care so much about this issue? And I think that's sort of what you're looking for, is somebody that just won't quit. And there's even a term for this. It's the cockroach startup, where you pound it over the head 100 times and it still just doesn't die.
Yeah. And that's quite a visual. There you go. Good stuff. Well, let's jump into your book a little bit, The Fuzzy and the Techie. You noted some very prominent tech company leaders whose educational background was in the liberal arts. Names that you mentioned are people like Peter Thiel at PayPal and Ben Silbermann at Pinterest and Carly Fiorina, just to name a few. Describe your assessment of these leaders and use of their fuzzy skills and what made them so successful.
Yeah, so the terms, the fuzzy and the techie, I'll take a step back and define those. So these terms actually come from Stanford back in the 1960s, 1970s, and they were these lighthearted kind of monikers on campus where people would say, are you more of a fuzzy or are you more of a techie? Are you taking more psychology, philosophy, social science subjects, or are you taking, more engineering heavy or computer science type courses? And really, it's a false dichotomy because, as you know from, world of mechanical engineering, for example, a lot of it has to do with design thinking. It has to do with customer research, user experience research, figuring out what's in the mind of your consumer, and then on the flip side, you take a course in political science or social science, and oftentimes there's use of statistical software, there's independent and dependent variables, there's highly, kind of quantitative aspects of social science as well. And so, it's not so much about one being fuzzy, one being techie, but I think about how we blend these two skill sets of, soft skills and hard skills in organizations. And so the observation that I had, in BC was that so many of these companies had people at the helm that, were more problem centric, that had a methodology and a way of thinking that, they may not have been a trained technologist. And I think when you look around Silicon Valley, the kind of prevailing narrative about the Valley is that it's a monolith of techies. It's technical people. It's, everyone is an engineer. And if you study science, technology, engineering, and math, you will be successful in the future, or you'll be set up to participate in this world of big data and AI and all this stuff. And we forget that on the flip side, all of the, the impact of ethics and regulation and thinking about the, how this technology affects human problems and sort of human endeavors requires, more than just the technology, more than just the code, it requires the context. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of these leaders, like you mentioned, from Peter Thiel at PayPal and Palantir, the CEO of Palantir is a guy named Alex Karp, who has a PhD in neoclassical social theory, not exactly big data.
No.
You look at Ben Silbermann has a degree in Pinterest, a degree in political science, and he founded Pinterest. And you sort of look around the valley, and it's not really this uniform story. There are people, coming at problems from various different ways. And I think beneath the hood of what makes a lot of these companies successful, it's take a look at Facebook, for example. You might say, well, it was the technical prowess of Mark Zuckerberg to write PHP and create a blue and white website. Well, I don't think that tells the whole story.
No.
There's a lot of psychology behind it. Really, the driver of virality at Facebook was photo tagging. Photo tagging was the key moment where people started really coming back and fueling the growth and engagement on Facebook. Newsfeed obviously has had a big impact, for positive and for negative benefit as well. And there are things to think about. And so a lot of the questions I think that are being faced in Silicon Valley, being grappled with by these companies, they're not always just the technical questions. They're increasingly, I think, the ethical questions are the questions around First Amendment rights. Does Facebook have an obligation to mitigate what's on its platform? Do they have a moral responsibility? Do they have a legal responsibility? These are all questions that beget hiring lots of people that aren't necessarily just pure technologists.
So when looking at fuzzy versus techie, why don't you give our audience your perspective as to the emotions that differentiate these two related to their ability to motivate or lead other people?
Yeah, it's interesting that there's so much conversation today around sort of the future of jobs and the future of automation and where that will lead. And, I think that the notion is that if we have technical skills, we'll be set up for success, tomorrow. And I think that obviously being fluent and being literate in data, being literate in technology is a hugely important component. But also, the interesting thing, and I think the way the pendulum is kind of swinging back the other way, away from sort of fear around robots and fear of AI and of data and these sort of newfangled things that are, lionized in the media, and we see them, we read them on a daily basis. As the pendulum swings back the other way, I think we think about what these technologies will take over in our jobs. They will take over the tasks that are repetitive. They'll take over the tasks that are highly rote or routine. And what they leave are actually a need for the human skills, for the soft skills, for being able to be a human-to-human interface, to be able to read somebody, to have empathy for them, to be able to collaborate with them or communicate effectively with them. And these are, a lot of the skills that have been sort of classified as soft skills. And it's not a pejorative thing. I guess that's just the way we describe them. But I think increasingly, those are the skills that are going to matter equally with being sort of technically literate. And so I think that we all need to cultivate these skills, whether we have a propensity to be fuzzier or techier. I think we all need to cultivate the other. And so, I think we need to break down the barriers of if you love psychology and you love philosophy and you're pretty much on the fuzzy side, like I would describe myself, I've really made an effort to learn how to speak in the tech world, to learn how to, I don't necessarily know all of the components, but I kind of have a rough cut estimate where the building blocks are. And I think, as these chunks become bigger and bigger, we can sort of assemble them more readily, even if we don't have a background, in computer science. And on the flip side, I think, if you're a really talented engineer, the realization that, to progress in your career, to become a manager, all these things, you also need to cultivate these soft skills to be able to manage people, to be able to, to see from another's perspective or be able to deal with opinions you might not agree with. And so, these are characteristics that I don't think that are uniformly fuzzy or uniformly techie, but ones that we need to kind of cultivate together.
Given that you are a self-described fuzzy based on your political science major at Stanford, give our listeners some of your key thoughts about your ability to promote leadership skills in others using your educational background.
Yeah, so my educational background was, I think, twofold. I mean, in a political science degree, I sort of gained fluency with some aspects of technology, using statistical software, thinking about, economics and thinking about, game theory and some of that stuff. But really, the core competency that I think I learned through my degree was the ability to communicate and write effectively. And I found that my first job at Google, at the beginning I said, well, gosh, I don't have some of these technical skills like some of my colleagues. But then I realized I had this ability to sort of observe from a macro level what was happening within the company, to start writing effectively about what was happening in the company. And within about 6 months, I put my finger on one trend that I noticed, which was there wasn't much product feedback coming from India. And I started asking the question, which I think is an important thing that we kind of overlook. We live in this world of answers where everything is on Google, but we forget that we have to be able to ask the right questions in order to obtain those answers. And so I started asking the question of why is there not product feedback coming from India? And people said, well, it's just the way it is. People don't have as much interest in product over there. And so I started, asking this question more deeply, and I started interviewing people in India. I started having friends, pull data that I could sort of use in a presentation to talk about this issue. And ultimately I ended up pulling together, a 10 or 15 page report that I started giving to senior leaders in Mountain View, and they said, well, gosh, this is a problem. We need more product feedback from India. Why don't you go over to India and help fix this? And so within about 6 months of being at Google, I was sent to India, with a driver and an apartment and a mandate to basically set up a team to improve product feedback. And I spent a year in India. And the hard and fast rules at Google were you can't go abroad, you can't transfer offices until you've been here for at least 2 years. And so I think the reality set into me that I had a skill set that was valuable, that it was the ability to observe and to communicate and to be able to convince of a certain narrative. And I think that was something that I realized, it wasn't a second class set of skills. It was actually a fundamentally important set of skills. And so then I kind of, embarked on trying to do that more.
So when you got to India, what was let's just call it the cultural differences that you saw between the US-based feedback mechanism and getting feedback from India, which is a different culture? I would assume, you tell us, is there different motivations? What causes people's emotions about a product or a service or et cetera? What are the drivers over there that might be different than here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the main observation was there was hesitancy to provide feedback because there is an assumption that they were far away and that people in the US were smart. They had already figured out this stuff. They were probably sort of saying something that had already been heard, it had already been tried. And so they said, well, I'm sure you guys have already thought of this, so why even bother to provide the feedback? And so what we did was we set up a local ideas council, which were people from the product team that sat locally in these different Indian offices who collected and collated the feedback, and they sort of aggregated it up and they sent it on to the specific product managers in Mountain View. And then quickly we realized that the feedback that people were giving in India was entirely accretive. It was completely different because the user base in India and in other emerging markets was very different than what users were doing with Google products in the US, for example. And so product managers said, this is incredibly valuable feedback because we don't actually have this understanding of how our product is being used on a mobile phone that's a feature phone with limited bandwidth, and there are whole different sets of issues that we were encountering. And so really it was about sort of communicating to people in India that their feedback was equally valuable, that we didn't necessarily know it, we hadn't heard it already, and we wanted to hear their feedback. And the second component that I found really interesting, and I think speaks to some of the value of liberal arts education that I think we kind of take for granted in the States, which is to have a multiplicity of courses where we're kind of put into uncomfortable situations, where we're studying something that may not be the thing we're the best at, to having to debate issues and see kind of the gray areas between issues in philosophy where there is no real right answer. And so in the process of training some of the members of my team, I found that people would call me over to their desk and they'd say, I think it's either this or this. What do you think? What's the right answer? And repeatedly, I had to say, I don't know what the right answer is. There is no right answer. I trust your judgment.
Right.
I trust you. There's a reason why Google hired you. You're very capable of making this decision equally to me. And so I can't tell you what the right or wrong answer is. You just need to make a determination and then stand by it. And it was a really uncomfortable thing for a lot of people. And they may have called me over to their desk 100 times before they really internalized, okay, I have the agency to actually make this decision, and Scott's not going to come get mad at me. And I don't really get mad, so.
Right. Incredible. That's funny. So, talking about the liberal arts background and education, I really found it interesting in your notes in the book about Vinod Khosla from Sun Microsystems. And that's a place where I actually worked for 9 years, and kind of his lack of belief in soft skills. So, quite frankly, my experience at Sun was really more of a culture of love, where there was a sincere compassion for everyone around you to really succeed, and a true generous nature to help others succeed as well. That's what I believe made Sun successful, and it sort of emanated directly from Scott McNeely, who was the CEO of the company. So, and he didn't have a techie background. What have you found in fuzzy skills that really make the difference for successful leadership?
It's a great question. I think that, so I also have an affinity for Sun Microsystems, because that's where my father worked when we first moved out to California in the early 90s. And so I also remember the good old days of Sun, and they were in, I think, the former Silicon Graphics campus, which may now be the Facebook campus. I can't keep it straight, but these buildings sort of transform from one tech behemoth to the next as sort of generations change. Yeah. And so it's interesting, and that sort of poses the question of, today we think about Google and Amazon and Facebook as these sort of monoliths that will exist forever, and it's interesting to kind of pose that question of the times, that every decade or two, things really do transform and change in the same way that those buildings transformed from one company to the next. It really is kind of focused on leadership and on sort of staying top of product, top of mind. But the skills specifically for leaders, I really think that, that having a clear vision of where you're going. And so I think being able to see the 60,000 foot view, to not get caught up in the specifics necessarily of technology, but know exactly the broad strokes of where you're going, and being able to communicate that effectively. So I think, these skills around communication are hugely important. I think, equally being empathetic to customers and customer needs, customer demands. I think that's fundamental to kind of finding product market fit. And I think companies that do that really well are able to read customers effectively. So I think that these human skills are right up there with the sort of the technology skills that are kind of required to be at the top of these great companies. It's a good question. I mean, I don't know. I don't have a great answer, but I think that, one of the drivers of so much success in these companies, I think, is the ability to bake together behavioral psychology and really sort of what helps move the needle on somebody engaging with a product. And I think these have both positive and negative consequences. I think one of the things that I talk about in the book is the attention economy, and how sometimes what companies are optimizing for may not be what consumers necessarily want to optimize for. When I see the notifications all across my phone, that's great from a key performance indicator for that company of, if you can draw me in, I become a monthly active user, you have engagement metrics, you can show those to your venture capitalists. They're happy about that because the company looks like it's going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. But taking a step back to the consumer side, those may not be the types of interactions that I want to optimize for in my day. And so I think the companies and the leaders that can really do this effectively can kind of balance between, having a product that's obviously highly engaging and can monetize through whatever business model they've chosen. Many of them today monetize on engagement through advertising, but doing that in a way that's not so in your face or not so manipulative or nefarious that it takes away from the consumer's ability to also choose. And I think these are really these are big issues that we're starting to grapple with just the scale of technology. The fact that the average person touches or swipes their phone, I think, over 2,000 times a day. It's a lot of interrupted moments.
Yeah, mostly to get rid of those damn notifications that you
probably
get.
True.
Yeah.
And you think about some of these behavioral tweaks where you have a team of 100 engineers optimizing to pull me into Twitter as frequently as possible. And if you look at a small product tweak like the notification dot, there's a small hesitation when you log into Twitter. It doesn't show up immediately. It actually waits for a second. And these small things that we think of as arbitrary or random are actually highly A/B tested. There's a lot of attention going into, okay, if we delay the gratification of that notification by half of a second, do people come back more frequently? Have we created, in B.F. Skinner terms, the behavioral psychologist, have we created sort of a variable reward where this becomes very addictive, where people say, gosh, I want to click on that again because maybe I get the red dot. Maybe I get two notifications this time. And those are things that draw us back into products, but they have real ramifications as well. And so, I think leaders have to be able to obviously make the business work, but also sort of see the big picture of what problems are they solving, and how is this really impacting the human condition as well.
Well, I tell you what, if you don't mind, let me ask you about you personally before, during, and after writing the book. It's a big undertaking to write a book. What emotions kind of did you experience through the process of writing your book?
It's a good question. I think early on, probably, when you work through the process for a nonfiction book, you write a proposal is kind of the first step. And so the book proposal is this odd beast where nobody really tells you exactly what they want to see. It's kind of reminiscent of how VCs will see a pitch and they say, well, it's not quite what we're investing in right now, and the entrepreneur writes you a couple emails and they say, well, what can I do to change it? And you say, well, I don't know, it's just not quite right. And it has nothing to do with you. It has to do with a bunch of other factors, like the internal dynamics of the partnership and where they may be thinking about investing. And I think the same is sort of true in the book world. And so for about 1 year, I just worked on the proposal of kind of putting together the rough cut of what I wanted to write about. And that was a disenchanting process, to say the least. There were moments of frustration where you've written the same thing over and over, and the proposal is 40 pages, 50 pages long, and nobody's really giving you clear feedback on when it's going to be done, when it's going to be ready to show to publishers. And so that process was a challenge. But then I had the fortune of meeting a literary agent, and at one point she said, I think this is great. Let's go show this to publishers. And then there was kind of a moment of excitement where you go and you do the pitch, and you go to a few different tall buildings in New York, and you walk into a boardroom and a bunch of people have stacks of books on the table, and they say, how are you any different than any of these books? Why are you the right person to write this? And you have to kind of defend what you want to do and sort of sell your vision the same way that an entrepreneur does in front of a VC. And then there was sort of a moment of elation when you get a deal to somebody says, I believe in you and I'm willing to buy the rights to have you work on this for the next 6 months or the next year. Mm-hmm. And then the reality sets in where you say, gosh, okay, now I have a deadline. And I've got to produce this thing that's really complicated. There's a lot of moving pieces, and yeah, I think for me, I really enjoyed the people process of interviewing people, having calls, kind of doing the research, and fleshing out the narrative. Writing people's stories, and then the tougher thing for me was grappling with the structure and sort of the cadence of how you blend storytelling with facts and data. Mm-hmm. You don't want to have something that's too esoteric and it's all facts and all data. Then you'd probably be better off going with an academic publisher, but you wouldn't get the scale and reach and distribution that you do with a trade publication. Mm-hmm. The difference with a trade publication, though, is you have to write for a mainstream audience. So any term that you throw out there, you have to spend half a page defining what that is. So if I mention the term cloud computing, my publisher would write back and say, well, what the heck is cloud computing? And you have to spend half a day trying to figure out, okay, how can I describe this so that my mother can understand what cloud computing is? Right. Even though if I have a rough understanding of how to describe it, it's still kind of difficult to pin it down in a way that somebody who's picking up the book in an airport might be able to say, yeah, I can handle this book. It's not too over my head. And so, there's sort of the ups and downs of working through that process, and the elation, the high moments, and then the frustration, the sort of 11th hour where you realize you have to restructure 300 pages and it's due in 24 hours. And, those sorts of moments that are, I think, reminiscent. We've all had those deadlines, whether in, companies or college or wherever it was. And it's part of that fun process.
So I tell you, we do have a question from one of our listeners related to your experiences. It's from someone named Cheryl. She's recently graduated with a liberal arts degree from Berkeley and is working with some recruiters to secure a role at one of the tech firms in San Francisco, like Twitter or Uber. She wants to know, what guidance do you have during the interview process for really capturing my liberal arts background as a benefit for one of these tech companies?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing you can communicate, I think two things. One is, the barriers to learning how to talk the talk have come down so much. I've been in, many different parts of the world, as you talked about. And one of them was an entrepreneurship competition that was in Dakar, Senegal. And this was with the State Department. And a young man came up to me at the pool and he said, "Can I show you my mobile app?" And he approached me and he was wearing this long kaftan, this long robe. And I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "I'm from Mauritania." I was like, "Wow, how many mobile apps have you built?" And he pulls out about 4 cell phones out of his different pockets in his kaftan, and he shows me all these different Android and iOS apps that he's built. And I said, "How did you build all this stuff?" He said, "Well, I read TechCrunch and I ask questions on Quora and I read Stack Overflow, and I've taken some General Assembly classes and I used Codecademy and Treehouse." And he started naming out all these products that are available, whether you live in Palo Alto or you live in Dakar, Senegal. and so I think for all of us, we've got to recognize that you can't just waltz into an interview and know nothing about the company or nothing about technology and be successful. So I think we all have to own up to learning a little bit of the nuts and bolts of being conversant, being literate in some of these new tools. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think the real selling point for having a background in theater or political science or anthropology is you've really learned to debate. You've learned to write effectively. You're a strong communicator. You have very flexible skill sets. I think if you've shown the grit and the curiosity to also sort of unlock some of the technical skills through taking an online course, taking something at night, I think to me that communicates, wow, this person is hungry. This person really wants to get into tech. This person has a really flexible set of skills. Those are all things that are highly desired at all these companies, because frankly, when you come in after 6 months, you'll probably be doing a different job. You'll probably be doing something as the company moves and progresses and grows. They're going to need people that are, sort of functional in ambiguity, where they can sort of move from one thing to the next and not need a ton of guidance, be able to self-teach. And I think those are all really important things. If you can communicate that effectively, they're going to know that you're somebody that can succeed as the company changes.
That's some great recommendations. I'm sure Cheryl will get some benefit out of that. Terrific. Thanks so much. So your book is available on Amazon, and people can get a glimpse at the book via a free chapter download, which was awesome, on your website, fuzzytechie.com. Where else can our listeners see or hear you and your work?
So I try to keep everything updated on fuzzytechie.com, but I've also got a Facebook page and an Instagram page. I don't really use Snapchat yet. I'm still working on that. But those are all those properties are, at Fuzzy Techie for Instagram and for Facebook. So, and please, feel free to reach out to me on the website or on one of those platforms. And, I love to hear from readers as far as stories that resonated or things that they'd like to hear more about.
Well, Scott, it's been very insightful to have you on the podcast, and I sincerely thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you, John.
This is John, and I look forward to being with all of you again on another episode of the Emotions Matter podcast.